All right, hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Can. I'm here with Linkso, and we have a fantastic class by the Master Gardeners today about backyard composting. And I know some of you sent in your questions, and hopefully we'll address that today. And we have Kelly and Nancy, so please welcome them today. And the floor is all yours. Kelly and Nancy, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Can. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our backyard compost troubleshooting workshop. And thank you also to Can and Linkso for hosting us today. Just to make sure everyone's in the right place, this workshop is for people who already have some experience composting in their backyards and have questions. As we said in the workshop description, if you are new to composting, you're welcome to listen in and learn, but this is not just a basic how-to compost class. And if you happen to have worms in your backyard piles, that's great, and you are still in the right place. But if you're looking for a troubleshooting class specifically on vermicomposting, we welcome you to return for that workshop on October 12th. So just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping here. We're going to have everyone muted during this class just to avoid kind of extraneous noise. And this presentation is being recorded, so it's up to you whether you'd like your video to be on or off. And if you have questions as we go through today, please put them in chat and look for ask questions here, and Can will help kind of moderate our questions. So now we'd like to introduce ourselves. So my name is Kelly Torikai, and both Nancy and I have been Master Gardeners of San Mateo and San Francisco counties since 2018. As Master Gardeners, we volunteer our time to provide research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, integrated pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to the residents of the two counties. I've been a San Mateo County Master Composter since 2008, and I actually met Nancy through that program. The two of us now teach composting classes for the county together, and we enjoy sharing kind of the wonders of compost and the great benefits it has for healthy soil. We actually experiment with a few different methods and systems, and while I've done some hot composting at home, I compost with a cold backyard pile and several worm bins.
And hello, I am Nancy Kruberg, and as you just heard and know from the presentation that I am a Master Gardener and also a Master Composter. I did the Master Composter class in 2014. I really love learning about soil life and composting, and do that through a variety of methods such as reading, attending workshops and conferences. I was privileged to study with Dr. Elaine Ingham for about 7 years. And at home, the composting methods that I use are hot pile, cold pile, and I also have a couple of worm bins. So now we'd like to get to know you a little bit. So we are launching a poll, and in that poll, we want to know how you compost and how long you have compost. So please answer both of those questions and then press the submit button. And these are totally anonymous, so no one's going to know who's saying what. So please participate. That's great. Keep them coming. We've almost got, well, I think we've got over half. That's good. Anybody else want to jump in there? Okay, we can end it there. Okay, so it looks like we have a close tie for people who are passively and actively composting. A few more are doing the passive method, but quite a few are doing hot as well, and that's awesome. And then as far as how long people have done it, this is great. 1 to 5 years, you've had plenty of chance to do it. Several of you have done more than 5 years. Wonderful. And I'm happy to see some of the newer people. And I applaud the person who said, I've tried before, but stop, because I feel like that happens to a lot of people, and it's because they don't get the extra help, which we hope we're going to provide here today. Anyway, thank you for participating in that. Okay, let me put this down and go on to the next thing. Okay, so today during our workshop here, we are going to be taking about 20 minutes to review composting concepts, just so we're all sort of on the same page. Then we're going to be taking those pre-submitted questions and answering them. After that, we'll take about a 5-minute break and then come back with your questions that you have been putting in chat. All right, now I'm going to turn you over to Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. So as Nancy said, we're starting out with this overview, so we're all kind of, on the same page here. And first is the definition of compost that we'll be using today. We want to be clear on this because there are many different ways to compost. And today we'll focus on compost that is the result of controlled aerobic decomposition of organic matter. And aerobic means with air versus anaerobic, which means without air. We do want to acknowledge that there are anaerobic methods of composting, and even in aerobic compost piles, there might be small anaerobic pockets. However, anaerobic composting generates greenhouse gases, which are bad for the environment and climate change. When it's done purposely, it's usually done on a large scale with methods that trap emissions and odors. So when composting at home, though, in the backyard, the University of California, UC Cooperative Extension, and Master Gardener program generally favor aerobic methods. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So now that we've got the definition of compost, the following are qualities of a good finished compost. Today, we're going to mention several times to use your senses, especially sight, smell, and touch, and we'll begin doing that right here. So first, what does compost look like? The color of compost is going to vary a bit with the feedstock ingredients that you use to make it, but it'll generally be around the color of 70% chocolate. Nancy and I really both like chocolate, so we use the color of chocolate as a gauge here because we relate to that well. So as you can see, in this top photo, the color of the compost in the background is closer to that 70% chocolate on the right versus the milk chocolate on the left. Also, the look of compost that you make yourself may be chunky with different sizes of clumps rather than something that's really fine. So as shown in the bottom photo on the left, it may contain some pieces of harder, more carbon-rich woody materials that aren't fully broken down. And on the right in that photo is the same compost after it's been sifted, and the light specks are just eggshells. So this homemade compost is in contrast to commercially made products that tend to be, or that tend to look a little more uniform because the ingredients may have been chopped more finely and the compost may have been sifted. So next, use your sense of smell. Good finished compost should have a nice earthy smell if you can smell anything at all. It should not smell bad or make your nose crinkle. Then also use your sense of touch to feel the temperature of the compost, and it should be at ambient temperature and not hot. Heat is produced by microbial activity that indicates ongoing decomposition. So hot compost is unfinished compost. And then just a last little note here, good finished compost contains all the different types of microbes in the food web, including beneficial bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes, which you can't actually see without a microscope, but especially for compost that you make in your backyard, you should see insects and other invertebrates that eat these smaller organisms. So seeing the larger organisms indicates that those beneficial microbes are also present. And we just want to remind you kind of what goes on in a compost pile. So there's just a dazzling array of organisms that actually help to make compost, and many of them you can't even see. So in a compost pile, you're essentially growing these microorganisms, and you want to make sure that the habitat in the compost pile suits them. And then by adding this finished compost to your soil, you're providing nutrients, organic matter, and all those microbes that cycle nutrients right in the root zone of your plants. And also compost helps improve soil structure. We can't get away without mentioning that. So now how do you foster, this habitat for all these helpful microorganisms? And the answer also happens to be the things that you want to think about if you're looking to troubleshoot issues in your compost pile. And that's the big four of browns, greens, air, and water. So browns are the materials that have more carbon in them, such as wood chips, fallen leaves, cardboard, and newspaper. And these browns are decomposed more slowly and mainly by fungi. Greens are the materials that have more nitrogen in them, like food scraps, plant trimmings, and coffee grounds. And greens are decomposed more quickly, mainly by bacteria, and they're really what cause the pile to get hot and stay hot. Air is necessary for an aerobic process and all the aerobic microbes. And then water is also necessary for microbes to thrive. However, you don't want the pile to be too wet, which can produce anaerobic conditions. So a good analogy for the ideal level of moisture in a pile, which is around 50%, is that of a wrung out sponge. So if you take a handful of compost and squeeze it, you should produce just 1 to 2 drops of fluid as shown in the photo here. And then as an add-on to the big four for a hot active pile is the volume of the pile. It needs to be big enough to produce and maintain heat, and we'll discuss that in a little more detail soon. So we want to mention C to N ratio because you may hear this referred to, when people are talking about composting. And this is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. To say this simply, all organic matter has both carbon and nitrogen in them, but browns have more carbon and greens have more nitrogen. The ideal C to N ratio for starting a pile is 30 to 1, which you can achieve with a proper mix of browns and greens. So an easy approximation is to start with 50% browns and 50% green material, measured by weight or volume. And this really should get you close to that ideal ratio of 30 to 1. An example is in the photo here that shows 3 5-gallon buckets of browns on the left and 3 5-gallon buckets of greens on the right. And just to note, in this photo, the greens were actually dried down for storage. So they're not really a bright green, but rather slightly brownish green. And so C to N ratio is really more important for building a hot pile, which we'll get to. And you can get really detailed with C to N ratios if you'd like. For now, we're trying to keep this simple, but if you do have further questions about C to N ratio, please enter them in chat. So now let's review actually making compost. And based on the questions that we received by email, we're going to go into this in a little more detail than we had originally planned. First, we want to acknowledge that there are many methods and processes for composting, and we want to reassure you that you can be successful with any of them. However, choosing the method that best fits your situation and really understanding what to expect can help you feel, more satisfied and successful with what you're doing. So if we ask all of you to kind of close your eyes and picture your ideal compost pile, we would guess that most of you would imagine a big pile or bin full of warm, steamy, earthy smelling black gold. And, while you can ultimately get this result, and you can get a warm, steamy compost pile, it might take a little more time and effort, potentially, than your schedule and life allows. So sometimes your expectations might not quite match the reality of what's happening with your compost. If we're able to help you manage your compost piles better using your current method, that's great. But you may find after listening today that another method of composting may suit your situation better. So please keep an open mind. And we'll divide backyard composting here into two main methods, passive cold piles and active hot piles. So here's a summary, comparison of cold and hot pile backyard composting. And, just a note, the hot pile is generally what people imagine when they picture a compost pile that's all warm and steamy and produces compost really quickly. So let's go through this chart. With a cold pile, you kind of add materials as you go, or you can build a big pile and just let it sit. A hot pile, the way we're going to be talking about it today, is a batch process. So you build the whole pile at once, and you really don't add materials throughout the process. With a cold pile, the volume that you start with can vary widely. You can start with a really small amount of materials and work from there. With a hot pile, because it's a batch process that also needs that volume to maintain heat, you start with a large volume of materials and build a pile that's at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And that equals 27 cubic feet or 1 cubic yard. In a cold pile, the ratio of browns to greens, or the C to N ratio, is not as important, and the ratio doesn't have to be, quite as exacting as for a hot pile. With a hot pile, that browns to greens, or C to N ratio, is important so that your pile heats up and maintains heat. A cold pile takes less space because you don't need to move your compost bin or your pile to turn it. A hot pile needs more space for turning because it's easier really to turn from one spot to the space right next to it. And you'll usually need some room to collect and store the large volume of materials to build the pile. A cold pile is kind of less overall effort, and you may not even need to turn your pile. A hot pile, on the other hand, is a little more effort, at least for the first 2 to 3 weeks for monitoring, maintenance, and turning. Also, before you build the pile, you have to collect and properly store materials, which may include things like drying down your green materials. And building a hot pile itself just takes some time, and we usually find it takes about an hour or two. The time it takes to get finished compost with a cold pile is about a year, even up to 2, whereas a hot pile can produce finished compost in just 3 to 4 months. In a hot pile, in a cold pile, pathogens and seeds might remain viable, whereas in a hot pile, you can generate enough heat to neutralize pathogens and seeds. So we hope this chart is helpful in kind of understanding the main differences and some of the expectations with a cold or hot compost pile. So now, focusing kind of on each process, we'll start with a cold pile. Again, with a cold pile, you generally add ingredients as you obtain them, or if you have a lot of leaves, say in the fall, you can put together a big pile and just let it rest there. The ratio of browns to greens is ideally around 50-50, but as I just mentioned, this is not as important as with a hot pile. The caveat here is that you don't want to have too high a percentage of greens in a pile that you're not managing very closely, because greens can decompose really quickly and potentially become anaerobic. So that's something to watch for. And with a cold pile, the starting volume, again, can vary widely. You can start with a small amount, and the pile will get bigger as you add more materials and build the pile. So for building and maintaining a cold pile, to start, it's best to begin with a layer of browns, then add greens, and just kind of repeat your layers, always keeping a layer of browns on top. To add materials, if you have greens, You can then just cover them with another layer of browns, or if you don't have any browns to add, bury those greens under that top layer of browns that's already on the pile. If you add a lot of greens at once, the pile may heat up for a little while, and that's fine, but it probably won't maintain that heat because cold piles are usually smaller. And then for maintenance, check air and moisture and turn and water as the pile needs it. Then to finish the compost, it might take a year or two, and you generally can just harvest compost from the bottom. So now a hot pile, which is, again, we said a batch process, meaning you gather all your ingredients and process them at the same time. You want the proportion of browns to greens to be around 50-50 or up to around 60-40. If you want your pile to heat up and stay hot, you need that mass. So at minimum, your pile should be that 27 cubic feet. In cooler weather, though, sometimes it helps for the pile to be a little bit larger. So when hot composting, it's expected that the pile get hot and steamy and kind of stay that way for 10 to 14 days, depending on what you put in the pile. If you want to do a hot pile more casually, you can just turn it every few days until the pile truly starts to cool down, and then let it cure for a few months, and you can use it at that point. However, if you want to be more deliberate and closely monitor temperatures so that you know that weed seeds and pathogens are dealt with, you can do that. In order to take care of that, though, you'll need to maintain a temperature of 131 degrees Fahrenheit or 55 degrees Celsius for 3 days. And ideally, your pile is going to range between 140 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, that target temperature range is in what we call the hot middle of the pile, because temperatures on the outer parts of the pile are going to be a little bit lower. In order to take care of weed seeds and pathogens, though, you want to make sure that you turn your pile carefully so that all the material is cycled through that hot middle for at least 3 days above 131 degrees. So let's see how to turn your pile to make sure this happens. So this diagram is a cross section of a pile divided into 3 sections, top, middle, and bottom. So the red circle there is the hot middle. The blue rectangle on the top is what we will refer to as the top, but notice it does come down a little bit on the sides. And then the green rectangle on the bottom, we'll call the bottom, but it also comes up a little on the sides. So when you build your pile, it can take 1 to 3 days to reach 131 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it does, you want to start your timer. So once that hot middle section is over 131 for 72 hours or 3 days, then it's time for the first turn. You take the top and put it aside on a tarp. Then you take that hot middle and put this as the bottom of your new pile. And you can make a little bit of a bowl shape in it if you'd like. So then you take the material that was on the tarp and you make that the new middle of the pile. And finally, you take the material that was on the bottom of the original pile and put it on the top and then a little bit down the sides of the new pile. So start taking temperatures again, and when the pile comes back up over 131, start your timer. Then take regular readings, and once it's been over 131 degrees for 3 days, it's time for the second turn. So you turn your pile the same way you did previously. So now the last section of the material will end up in the middle. So everything's gone through that hot middle. You continue to monitor your temperature, and when the pile reaches 131 again, start your timer, take your regular readings, and once your pile has been over 131 for 3 days, your whole pile has now been through that hot middle, and then seeds and pathogens should be taken care of. So at this point, now you'll turn the pile, and if the pile continues to stay hot, keep turning it as you just wait for it to kind of cool down. And during this time, when you turn your pile, you're really doing it to just finish that high temperature stage of hot composting. So once you get your cold pile going, you'll want to monitor it, or your hot or cold pile, actually. You just want to keep monitoring it, use your senses again, notice what you smell, feel, and see. If you choose to, it can be helpful to record your observations and, record temperatures if you're doing a hot pile with target temperatures and times. And then if anything is, out of whack, go into troubleshooting mode. So, figure out what issues have arisen and devise plans to correct them. Think about the big four of browns, greens, air, and water, and make sure you have the right balance of those things. And if you're hot composting, think about the size of the pile. And it can be helpful just to kind of keep records of your recipes, problems, solutions, and outcomes for future reference. So that ends our review. And now we'll address questions that were submitted before today. And just a reminder, if you have questions, use that chat feature and send them to Ask Questions Here.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. All right. So our first question actually is an accumulation of questions, some from this group and some from other places where we've gotten this, but always somebody wants to know if there's a certain ingredient that can go into a compost pile. And for a lot of these, I would have to say, just try it. Try a little, see how it does. But let's go through this with the response slide here. So somebody asked, can you put popcorn in? And I think we're guessing they're thinking because, well, gosh, it might have a little oil or butter and we're not supposed to put those things in. We say, yes, put it in. It's not going to be like, it's not like putting a bottle of oil in there or a cube of butter. It's just a little bit on the popcorn. It should be just fine in your pile. Then how about those compostable plastic bags? Well, they say they're compostable, right? Well, generally, they're only compostable in a commercial composting situation. So that's where you should put it. If you want to try it in your backyard, I suppose you could go ahead and do it, but they really are meant to break down in a really high heat situation. Kelly, did you have anything else you wanted to add on the compostable bags?
Well, the only thing is some of them can be kind of confusing. I actually have a bag that says home compost okay, but it also has a little symbol that says commercial compost only. So sometimes those can be a little bit tricky. Yeah, if you want to try it, I would say, try to control the situation as well as you can. In case you need to take it out of your pile.
Yeah, it's a little confusing.
It can be confusing.
All right.
Yeah.
Then the next thing is, do I need to put worms in? Because everybody thinks of compost with worms. And it's really not necessary. If you have your pile on the ground, worms are most likely going to come in from your soil and come into the pile. And it's really lovely to have them there. I can think of some other situations, though. For instance, sometimes I want to take my hot compost and finish it with worms. So I might put it in a container and then put worms in there for them to work on the pile for several months so that I end up with worm composting, the worm compost that started as hot compost. So in that situation, yes, I would add them, or sometimes I feed my hot compost to my worms. But some
But after
people
it's cooled down.
Oh, definitely. Thank you, Kelly. Definitely after it's cooled down. Oh my goodness. Yes. But you've dealt with the weed seeds, which worms cannot deal with the weed seeds. They are pretty good. If it goes through a worm's body, those pathogens are usually taken care of, but not weed seeds. So as long as the reason to hot compost first is to get rid of those weed seeds and then feed it to your worms if you want to do that. But Kelly, I know, has a great story about tumblers.
Yes. So we do get people asking if they should add worms to tumblers, and we say, please don't, because it's not really the right environment for them. We can certainly talk a little bit more about vermicomposting and worms in October, but you know, worms aren't really meant to be tumbled around, and we're actually experimenting with a tumbler right now. And just last week, I tumbled the tumbler, opened up the door, and found the back half of a worm. So he got kind of damaged. Worms don't tend to regenerate, you know, missing pieces all the time. So worms in a tumbler can be a little bit dangerous to your worms.
Thank you for sharing the story, Kelly.
It was kind of sad.
I know. All right. So for the rest of them, people ask about coffee, and we're assuming they mean coffee grounds. And coffee grounds are great in the compost pile. They are actually, even though the color is brown, they are a green. They're full of nitrogen. It's a great addition to your compost pile. We've been asked about rice hulls. It would be a brown. They're a bit hard to decompose, but they will decompose, and again, great for your pile. And then we've gotten questions about can poisonous plants, in this case, the person asked in the nightshade family, and I'm going to extend this out. So in the nightshade family, of course, I think of things like tomatoes and potatoes, and those are absolutely fine in your pile, no problem at all. But I do think about things like poison oak, which can cause a rash, and those oils just don't go away. So do not compost things that can irritate your skin. I would leave out of the compost. It's too much of a danger of you getting it on you, or when if it's hot composting, you might get, you know, those oils and the gases that come out, and it would be unpleasant. But I would, for things like poison oak, I would definitely reach out to your whoever your waste hauler is to find out which bin would be the appropriate place to put those things. All right, Kelly, I'll turn this one over to you.
Okay, so this next question is about covering compost with plastic. So I've been covering my hot compost pile with plastic to reduce moisture loss. Is this a good practice? And if not, can you suggest a better method? So, as to whether or not this is a good practice, it depends. On the downside, it may prevent airflow, but on the plus side, of course, it does reduce moisture loss, which is helpful in our climate. We would suggest using a breathable fabric, such as shade cloth, burlap, or weed barrier. Or if you can raise the plastic above the compost, even just a few inches, then you can provide some airflow there while still, you know, helping to reduce that moisture loss.
Super, thanks. Okay, now the following few questions we had about hot piles and temperatures. So I just wanted to put this in here. This was a pile I did years ago, but it shows kind of a typical, you know, heating and cooling of a regular old compost pile. So if you look at this graph, on the left are the temperatures, well, vertically are the temperatures, and on the y-axis here, horizontally, are the days and times. And what this is showing here, the blue line is the temperature rising and falling. The red dots here are the times that I turned this pile. And there, you don't need to worry about all the nitty gritty, but this is what I want you to focus on. First, I want you to notice where the peak temperatures are, how it's really high when the compost pile is new. And as we go on in time, those peaks get lower and lower and lower till eventually the pile cools. That's a pretty typical way that a compost pile goes. I also want you to notice that when you turn a pile, say right here, this was the first turn, watch how much the temperature goes down, but then it bounces right back up, assuming you've got the right ingredients in there that are, meaning those greens, that are helping those temperatures go up. And then it turned again and again, down it went, and up it bounced again. And then I also would like you to see here, so the temperature, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to point out this red dash line is 131. And when it got below 131, it got turned again and the temperatures went down as we expected. And then it actually bounced up, excuse me, over 131, but only for a little while. I'm wondering if you can think in your heads right now why it bounced up after going lower. I hope you were thinking that greens make it hot. There was still some greens left, that the bacteria went after, because the bacteria are the ones that are eating those simple materials and creating that heat. Yeah, and I think that's all I wanted to show before we go to the next questions.
Actually, Nancy,
Oh, yes.
when you're monitoring a hot pile like this, how
Yes.
often do you take temperatures?
Oh, that's a very good question. I do it twice a day. I learned this from Dr. Elaine Ingham, and I take temperatures morning and night so that I know exactly. Yeah, so I really take a lot of temperatures just to make sure that the pile is doing what it does. And Elaine was very much a stickler on turning it exactly the right time. So I learned from her. So thank you.
It is nice and helpful to have all that data, though.
It is. Yeah. It's really nice. Okay, so somebody sent in a recipe, and then they also sent in a time and temperatures for their pile. So we're going to go through that now. So this is the person's recipe. And on the left side, we have what they had for browns. So there were maple leaves, arbor mulch, and then horse bedding. Now, one of the things I want you to notice is that in the horse bedding, she mentioned there was horse urine and horse manure. And I have these in green because this part of the horse bedding is actually a green, not a brown. But for this exercise, she counted it as brown, so I'm counting it as brown for you. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. But if I were to coach her on doing this next time, I would say, figure out, was it a half a gallon of horse manure? Was it a gallon? And I would take that away from the browns and put it over here into the green column. But it really would make a very small difference, I think, from what I'm looking at here. But if you really wanted to do this more accurately, that's what you would do. And then the greens, she used lawn clippings and food scraps. So if we look at her totals, she had about 47 gallons of browns, which totaled 67% of the pile. And the total greens were 23 gallons, which was 33% of the pile. And total, she had 70 gallons, which I went on Google and figured out it was 11 cubic feet. So what I want you to think about right now, and what I think about when I look at this, is what do I expect this pile to do? Now, first of all, I'm looking and thinking, normally I do 50% browns, 50% greens, or at the most 60% browns and 40% greens. So this is a little higher on browns and a little lower on greens. And so what I would expect, that there are enough greens to make the pile heat a little bit, but then I would expect it to cool down more quickly than a pile that was, say, 60% browns and 40% greens. Also, notice the 11 cubic feet. If you recall Kelly telling you earlier, a minimum pile for a hot pile is usually 27 cubic feet. So this is much smaller mass. So again, it's going to tell me that it probably won't maintain heat for a long time. So let's see what actually happened. Okay. So again, here we've got the temperatures going up and down on the y-axis and the days on the x-axis on the vertical line here. The pile was actually started on July 29th. And by the 30th, it had gone up to 100 degrees, and then she kept taking the temperature. Eventually, it got up to about 150, which was 29, 30, like 2 days later. And this red diamond here shows when she turned it. And then you notice that, so it did go up, it got above 131. Again, that dashed line is showing 131. It was doing really nicely. Then she turned it here. Then it went down, which is, remember from that pile I showed you before, is what you expect. But then, oh my goodness, it didn't heat up again. So again, I'd like you to think in your mind, why do you think that this did not happen? Why would it not heat up again? All right, so if you go back to what we were just saying, is that if you remember the recipe, first of all, it didn't have a lot of greens, so it had enough to really heat it up nicely, but it probably didn't have enough greens after that first turn. It was probably eaten up by the bacteria, so it really didn't the temperature really didn't raise much. However, we don't have more data. Maybe it went up a little bit later on, right? We don't know. Also, they'll remember that the pile was pretty small. It was only 11 cubic feet instead of 27 or close to 27. And it could be there just wasn't enough mass in that pile to keep the heat going. So that's important to know. Now, I told you I learned from Dr. Ingham. And we also know the general consensus is keep it above 131 for 3 days. I would, if you're somebody who likes taking temperatures, I would turn it at that 3-day mark. So if we look right here, this is the first time, so this was on July 30th, that it got above 131. So I would count 3 days from then. So that would be the 31st, the 1st, I would have turned it on the 2nd. And in that case, there might have been a few more greens to actually make this pile heat up a little more. Hard to know for sure, but it might have. Okay, I think that's enough on that one, unless Kelly, you can think of anything that I forgot to say.
I think you covered it all.
Okay, yoo-hoo. All right, I'm gonna pass this off to you.
Okay, the next question is, could you speak to fire-fanged compost? Apparently, Elliot Coleman speaks about this in his book, The New Organic Grower. And I guess this question was asked because this person says, when I turned my compost, it was ashy and steamy. So did I let it get too hot? Well, first off, we actually had to go in the dictionary and check out what fire fang meant, and it is to become overheated, excessively dry, and damaged as a result of slow oxidative decomposition of organic matter. So it does sound like it relates. What this person found and what fire fang likely refers to is actually actinobacteria, and that's previously known as actinomycetes. And this is just a decomposer. So it's a natural part of composting, and actually actinobacteria is what gives compost that nice earthy smell. So next, we have a couple of photos that Nancy took. So you can see kind of this ashy looking actinobacteria. On the left is a layer of it that Nancy found when she was turning a hot compost pile. And then on the right, it shows a little closer view. So even though actinobacteria looks like ash, it doesn't necessarily indicate that the pile got too hot. When you find a thick layer like the photo on the left here, it's really more an indicator that the pile needs air and just needs to be turned. So not a problem.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay, then we have a question of when to use compost. The question is, how long should I wait to use compost that was made using horse shavings with urine and a little bit of manure? And this is going back to that same question we just talked about. So with any material, whether it was manure or not, if you have properly composted and cured it, then you can use it. So if you're someone who's taking temperatures and doing the hot composting, again, if all of the material has hit that hot middle, reached 135 or greater for 72 hours, if the whole pile has gone through that, you're fine. If you're somebody who's doing a little more casually, you know what, that's good. Just make sure you cure it for several months afterwards. Earthworms will make sure that pathogens are taken care of. And all the other little critters too, the sow bugs, the earwigs, all the critters are going to continue to work with that material, and it should be absolutely fine to use once it's all finished.
Okay, the next question is about a hot pile not staying hot. And to remedy this, this person added fresh chicken manure. Then the pile didn't heat up as expected. So, what happened or didn't happen? Was it a bad idea to add this? And there's a concern about pathogens. This person doesn't want those to move into the garden when they use the compost. So what should they do now? Well, we imagine that the pile didn't heat up because the chicken manure may have actually been older and acted more like a brown than a green, or potentially not enough was added. So it was not a bad idea to add the chicken manure as long as you add it kind of in that hot middle of the pile. And if you're concerned about pathogens, we would recommend that you just recompost this and make sure it gets hot enough for long enough. Or you can let this compost age for about a year and it should be fine after that, just as Nancy mentioned, with everything kind of helping to process the compost.
Great. All right, and somebody else said that they try to get their compost hot. It gets over 150 degrees, but they often find when they're using it in their garden that all these seedlings come up. So the question is how to avoid this, and is having seeds germinating in your compost a really bad thing? So Kelly and I really feel that germinating seeds is awesome. It's actually one way you can check to see if your compost is finished, whether your, compost is a good compost. Do seedlings grow in it? So this really is a sign of a good compost. Also, when you put compost into your soil, it does improve that soil structure. And when the soil structure is good, seedlings are very easy to remove. So if you don't want them, then you can easily take them out. However, if you want to make sure that seeds are not viable, then you should probably be taking temperatures and monitoring your pile closely so that everything gets to that hot middle for 3 days, just as we have explained.
Okay, this next question is about why a compost pile didn't heat up quite as expected, and can we use it? So the process that this person used, and taking temperatures here, showed that on the 11th, compost was at 132 degrees. On the 18th, it was turned. On the 22nd, the temperature was at 100 degrees, and they were thinking that it really should have gone up here after turning. The compost was turned again on the 30th, and then the temperature measured a couple days later on the 1st was 82. Again, it didn't heat. So, what's going on, and is it actually done now? So the first recommendation that we have here is maybe trying to take your temperatures a little more regularly. When you turn compost and you're expecting it to heat up, you do want to see it in kind of that 1 to 3 day time frame. So maybe checking at least once a day could be helpful. And then our guess here as to why it didn't heat up was there probably wasn't enough green material to heat up the pile. So, we would just recommend kind of looking at your recipe and rethinking it for next time, increasing the amount of greens. And this pile is probably done producing heat at this point. So we'd say, let it cure for another few months. Or you could actually start another pile now and just use this as the brown component for that new pile.
Super. And I realized one more thing we didn't think about saying, because we have no idea what the volume of the material was. So it could be that there wasn't quite enough volume material to have that mass to keep the heat going. All right, so if I have finished hot compost that I don't plan to use immediately, should I continue to maintain the moisture level? Should I turn it occasionally? Can I store it in a plastic trash can to make space for the next batch of hot compost? All good questions. So yes, you should maintain your moisture levels, because it's those microbes that are going to keep decomposing your material even further. And at least up to 6 months, some people say up to a year, the diversity in the micropopulation, it just keeps increasing, which is really great for your soil. But you could keep it at 50%. You could also, or as around that sponge, you could also keep it slightly drier, but not a whole lot drier. Okay, you don't want it to dry out. That's the only thing. It really is not necessary to turn your pile. It is better to leave it and let the fungi grow. However, if for some reason, like you had to go out of town for a while, came back, found the pile was super dry, you might want to gently turn and add moisture as you go, just to get it wetted up again. Other than that, leaving it is better. And then that plastic trash can, well, it would be great if you fix it. You would need to drill holes all over it. You want to make sure there's still air, because if you just stick a bunch of compost that you've just finished in a plastic container and there's no air, then those aerobic organisms will go to sleep and those anaerobic organisms will wake up and have a party in there. So keep the airflow going so that you have great aerobic compost to use in your garden. And also remember just to keep it out of the sun and heat wherever you're storing it.
Okay, and I'm going to take our last pre-submitted question here, and it's can I mix finished worm castings and finished hot compost together, store it, and then use the combination as needed throughout the year? The answer is definitely yes, and this is actually a great idea because there may be, well, very likely are different microbes present in each type of compost, and that diversity is just going to benefit your plants. And then, yes, you can store it, just as Nancy mentioned in the last question. Just make sure to maintain, some of that moisture and airflow, and avoid storing it in the sun. So before we take a break, we just wanted to point out this list of resources with more information that you can refer to later, and you will get these slides emailed to you. This list of references is online, and the next page is books that we really like. And I just want to say, Nancy and I have just been rereading Teaming with Microbes, the third book on that list there, for a little book discussion group that we've got going, and we've been just thoroughly enjoying that book again. It's a fantastic one, and it really does help to explain what's going on with compost. So I recommend that one. And then again, we just want to thank Linkso Garden Materials for hosting and supporting the presentation. We also want to thank three new Master Gardeners who helped us with this presentation: Karen Flores, Howard Hibbs, and Chelsea Taylor. And the next slide shows some links to subscribe to our Master Gardener newsletter and make a donation to our program if you'd like to support us. And if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer today, please submit them to the helpline, and another Master Gardener will research and answer your question. So I think at this point, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we can come back and start answering all kinds of questions from chat. So I guess we will be back at 1:58.
Wow, that's very precise.
I put a timer on my phone.
All right, see you then.
Maybe Kelly, if you could put up that break slide up, so if people are coming in, maybe they could see that.
Okay.
And we'll return in 5.
Okay, sounds great.
Thank you.
Guess we have to wait for Can to come back.
Yes, all of the questions.
Thank you for being here, everybody.
Yes, thank you. We wish we were in person.
I know. I like in person.
Yeah, and a format like this is a little challenging, but hopefully everyone can put their questions in chat.
All right, Can, do you have any questions for us?
Yes, I think a lot of these have been addressed, but
Okay.
maybe both can just briefly summarize the answers, just as reminders for people. Okay, so this person couldn't answer the poll whether using the hot or cold pile because they didn't know the difference. So maybe quickly, I know you both addressed it, but
that's okay. Kelly, you want to take that since you're well practiced by now?
Well, I kind of think the biggest difference is the batch process of the hot pile versus the really flexible, add as you go and as you have materials process for cold. And cold takes a little less effort and maintenance, I think. So personally, that really works well for me. Also, I don't have a lot of materials to compost, so I just add as I go, and that.
Yeah, and
Those are the big things that I see.
Yeah, I agree. And if that person, if whoever asked the question, if you want to do a follow-up question, please do, in case there's something very specific about your pile that we can address, because people do like hybrids and I don't know what to call it. People compost in all sorts of ways that are all right. So we just try to help define it a little more to help people understand it better.
Okay, all right. So the next question is grass and leaves a good composting element from their garden?
Yes, absolutely. And so now you need to know how to distinguish between greens and browns. So when you say grass, if you've got a lawn growing and you're mowing it, then that is a green material, and you could just leave it there too and feed your lawn. But that would also be a great material for your compost. However, if you're like my yard, which is a bit of a wild yard, there are certain times a year, such as when summer comes on, that the tall grasses have grown and they've died back, and you've got to cut them down for fire. Well, now that they've died back, now that's going to be a brown material for your pile. Okay. And the same thing with leaves. Are you talking about leaves that have fallen off the tree in the fall? In that case, those are browns. But if you have just like trimmed back a hedge that's gone over into your driveway and it's fully green, that will be a green leaf. So just be thinking about those kind of things.
Okay, great, because there were several questions regarding, at what point green leaf is considered brown.
Excellent.
Aging and, is
right. And aging matters. And and even like if you cut a let's say you've got a plant growing and it's starting to put out seeds. Well, all of the nitrogen stuff is going to the seed, and that plant material itself is going to be more toward the brown side than the green, if that makes some sense. So yes, the age of the plant matters. A newer growing plant is going to be packed with nitrogen and really get the heat going in your pile.
Oh, and Nancy, maybe you want to talk a little bit about drying down.
Oh yeah, and that's the other thing with drying down, because Kelly showed you I compost with buckets because it helps me count out the material. I do it by volume. And so I often, because I do like doing hot compost, and it's often hard to get all the materials you want right away, because certain seasons tend to have more brown materials, certain seasons happen to have more green. So when I, like this time of year, if I start trimming things back that are green, but I'm not ready to compost yet, I want to save it. So I trim back, prune back the branches, then I lay them out to dry, and they dry right away. Now the color, as you saw in the buckets, isn't bright green anymore, but as long as you dry it down right away and you keep it dry, it's still a green material. It's still got all the nitrogen in it. So when you're ready to compost it, you wet it back up and it acts like a green. And so that is a good thing to know.
Alrighty, so here's another question. So this person usually tries to hot compost, and one of the biggest problems for them is the various sizes of the materials that they use. And they're wondering, does it matter the size of the materials that they start with, and what is the best method to manage that? And do they need to chop the material up before using it? And how do you both manage this?
Great questions.
Very good questions.
So I'll go from simple to a little more complex. The simple thing is, the smaller you get your materials, the quicker it'll compost, because the more surface area there is for those microbes to eat it all up and decompose it. But then if you get everything teeny tiny, what's going to happen? You're going to get the whole pile anaerobic because things will glom together. Think about sawdust, which I never recommend for composting because it's just too fine and it will just glom, or for that matter, wet grass will do the same thing. It'll just stick together and stink, because I did that with my very first compost pile. And so anyway, so you want a variety of sizes. It's great if you can get most of your materials under an inch, like 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, maybe an inch, maybe a few things that are 1.5 inches, 2 inches, because you want a variety so that there is airflow through the pile. But know that some of those bigger chunky materials are going to take longer to decompose just because they're larger. Now, I do a lot of just taking my clippers and just clipping things. I do have one, I am really bad with gas-powered machinery, so I don't have a big chipper, but I did finally buy a chipper that's electric that can handle up to, gosh, what is it? Up to a 1/2 inch, or an inch and a half, I think, diameter. And I can get some branches through there, and that helps me out. It can't handle everything. It's not a huge, strong machine, but for some materials in my yard, it really helps me out. So yeah, mostly some of it I'm using my chipper, and a lot of it I'm just using my clippers to clip things into small pieces.
And I, mostly cold pile compost. So I do try to cut things up a little bit smaller because cold piles do tend to go a little more slowly. And yeah, I use, garden clippers or pruners, loppers sometimes to just chop things into pieces. Yeah. And, I end up with chunky stuff in the compost, especially in a cold compost pile.
I get them in hot compost too.
Well, yeah, that's true. But
yeah,
your chunky woody pieces are going to stick around for a little longer, and it's fine to use it. It almost turns into kind of a mulch if you use it to top dress, your soil. The larger pieces will just kind of naturally rise to the top and act as a mulch and basically protect your soil and the rest of the compost. But you can sift it if you want to take some of those chunkier pieces out. And then just, I just put the chunky pieces back into the compost.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to go back to that green brown issue.
Great.
I think a couple people are confused about it.
All right.
So if they cut a green hedge and save the material over a long period of time, is this a green or a brown?
Great. Good. I'm glad you re-asked the question. It is a green when you cut it. And if you're diligent about immediately drying it down, I have like plastic benches with, like grating on it, right? So there's airflow under. I put it on top of there. I make sure it dries down right away. And then I store it either in bags or something where it cannot get wet. So if you can dry those materials down and make sure they don't get wet until you're going to compost them, those are still green. Okay. However, if you cut them down and you leave them outside in a pile and the morning dew's getting on it and they're starting to decompose a little on their own, even not rapidly, it will over time become a brown material. So I hope that makes sense.
Or was there any part of that question that we didn't answer, Can?
I think you've got it. Here's another leaf-based question here. So this person has a lot of coastal live oaks, leaves and acorns, and the leaves are usually brown and dry. And they're wondering, can they be used in composting?
So absolutely, they do take a long time to decompose, but I actually compost under my coast live oak because it gives me lots of good shade. But they take a long time to decompose, but don't be discouraged by that. Use them. They're great. And there's lots of them. And oh, that's right. I forgot about another tool that I use too, because Kelly was nice enough to give it to me. I have an electric leaf blower, which if you reverse it, it actually is a leaf vacuum. And when it comes in through the vacuum, it actually shreds the leaves into a bag. And so whenever I can, I take my dried leaves and put it through that. And it really does get them into much smaller pieces. It's lovely. And I think Krista's here and she does the same thing.
And I mean, you can run over, large, harder leaves with, say, a lawnmower, or sometimes you could put, them into a bucket, or, something that contains them well enough, and put a string trimmer in there. And the string trimmer can help you chop up some of those things too.
Thank you for bringing that up, Kelly. The other thing I use if I'm trying to do a hot compost pile, but I don't have enough greens, sometimes I just buy hay at a feed store, and then I do the same thing with the hay. I put it in, you could put it in a large garbage can, or I have these macro bins, but most people don't have that. I'm just strange. I get people who give me these things, and I use a string trimmer to actually get the pieces of the hay smaller, because I found that the hay, because it has long pieces, they just tend to glom together a lot. And when I can use a string trimmer to break them down, they just compost better, and I don't have to kind of pull them apart all the time.
All righty. So this is sort of a vague question, but I'm guessing they're asking regarding the browns and the greens that you put into the compost. They're wondering, doesn't the chemical fertilizers kill the microbes in the compost?
So you shouldn't be putting any chemical fertilizers into your compost. But I'm wondering if they're thinking actually about like pesticide, herbicide residues on stuff. I mean, that's the only thing I could think about, because you wouldn't, if a plant is grown with fertilizer in the soil, that shouldn't affect your compost. So that plant's going to grow and it should be fine in your compost. What can affect it are herbicides, fungicides, any kind of pesticide that is supposed to kill life, could be detrimental in your compost. But unless it's one of those really persistent herbicides, most of it's going to be, sometimes the compost itself takes care of that stuff. It depends who you are. Like, if some people are just like, I'm going to make sure that all my material doesn't have anything on it, and other people go, well, I'm pretty confident that the composting process will take care of it. So I think it's kind of a personal choice what you want to do with it. But pesticides do are detrimental to microbes.
All righty. So we've got two big topics, and there are a lot of questions regarding that. One is pests and rodents and flies and things. And the other topics is pretty much horse manure, adding that to compost. So which one would you like to start off with? Because there are quite a lot of questions in each category there.
Okay, why don't we start with the rodents and stuff? That seems to always be a favorite.
Okay, all right. So then let's go back. Okay. So this person puts food scraps and bokashi powder into a bucket with a lid to reduce the smell and flies around the house. And after the bucket is filled up, they put them into the ground. And should they still mix with the greens and the browns? And what do you think about the bokashi powder in general? And do you think it's really worth to add to the compost?
Okay, so I can tell you from so there's not much in UC right now about bokashi, so I'm going to tell you more from my personal experience with it, because Kelly and I have actually both been experimenting with it. So I do like bokashi because it's a great way to preserve your food scraps till you're ready to do something with it. What I like to do with them when it's done is I use that as part of my green material in my piles. I've done it in a cold pile and I've used them in hot pile, and I've also used it to feed to my worms, which they love this stuff, which really surprised me, but they do. What you just said about digging them in the soil, that was what's recommended. So they call it bokashi composting, but it's not really composting. Bokashi is fermenting the foods, and I'm still trying to get a grip on exactly what's happening in there, but I know it kind of preserves the nutrition in it. And so when you put it in your soil, you're supposed to bury it and don't add anything else, just bury it down so critters don't get into it. And you know, assuming that you've got good soil microbes in there, apparently over about a 2-week time, everything should be gone, and then you could plant. So that's a big long answer, but there's all the different things that I know that you can do with bokashi.
Yeah, so bokashi is kind of like a pre-composting sort of method. It lets you, like Nancy said, kind of save some of these greens, and it does allow you to compost some things that normally you wouldn't put into a regular compost pile. So meats, fats, you can even put bones in it, and dairy like cheese. Which we would not recommend you put in a backyard pile because those kinds of things will attract pests, kind of, you know, moving to the next or kind of staying with that theme. So really, yeah, when you have your bokashi bucket that's ready to be, you know, emptied, you're basically trench composting your bokashi at that point. You know, you dig a trench in your soil, you put your fermented bokashi scraps, and then you close it back up. And like Nancy said, it's basically like this composting that's done, you know, in the soil. So I think the person asked if you would add greens or browns to bokashi. So for Nancy's case, when she was talking about, you know, putting it in your backyard pile, yes, you're adding greens and browns. If you're putting it directly into soil to basically trench compost it, you wouldn't add anything there. It's just the bokashi. Hope that's
Alrighty.
helpful.
So now let's go to the little critters. So we'll start small and then move to the larger ones. So this person's cold compost pile has lots of flies, and they always try to keep browns on the top, but is there anything else that they could do to prevent the flies?
So I'm wondering if you probably need more browns on top. I mean, having some flies is not a big deal, but when you have a lot of flies, it's not harmful. It's just annoying. And I'd say it's because things aren't covered enough. So I would add more browns to it, and see if that helps. Kelly, do you have anything else?
You know, the only thing I would say is a lot of times browns tend to be, you know, harder and larger and chunkier. So it's easier for, you know, flies to get down into, you know, where the food scraps are. So you might try, you know, either chopping up browns so that they're pretty small, or, you know, even adding maybe some shredded newspaper and cardboard. Just kind of adding a mixture of different sizes of brown materials can really help, I think, make that layer of browns a little less difficult to get through. So that might help also.
Okay, so here's an interesting pest issue. This person has baby toads in their worm bin, and they're wondering, or they're worried whether the toads might have eaten their red regular worms, because they've noticed their population have decreased. So anything that they could do in this
That's
scenario?
for October, but my first thing is, like, how are they getting in? I guess my worm bins are pretty sealed up tight.
Yeah, I would say first try to work on excluding them from the bin. So, you know, covering up any potential holes that might be around the bottom of the bin, potentially raising it. Maybe we can research
I get,
toads and whether or not they eat worms, and give you the answer in October.
It's a
So
great
yeah,
idea.
the first thing I would say is try exclusion first. Try to keep them from getting in.
Okay, so let's just address the larger rodents getting into the compost bins, and how do you prevent that, and what do you do if you do find the rodents in your compost bin?
do you want to take that first, Kelly?
Sure. So with rodents, exclusion, again, just like the little frogs, try to, you know, see where critters are getting in. If they're getting in from the bottom, we would recommend trying something like a 1/2 inch hardware cloth put down, you know, underneath the compost and then up the sides of the bin. Um, if critters are trying to get in from the top, you know, usually just covering it with, you know, a couple of bricks to keep the lid on, um, or putting a bungee cord over your lid can work. And then, you know, anything you can do to keep them from being attracted to the bin would be helpful. So keeping any food scraps or anything that might attract them, you know, in the middle of the pile with a good layer of kind of browns around the bottom, the sides, and the top. I think those are the things that kind of come to mind.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Let's move on to using animal manure, particularly horses. Can horse manure be added to cold and hot piles?
So the answer is yes. It depends how quickly you want to use it. So if you add it to a cold pile, you're going to have to wait, you know, at least a year before you can say that it's aged and composted enough that the critters have had their chance to do it all. And if you hot compost, then, you know, if you wanted, you could do it as soon as 3 or 4 months, but probably within at least 6 months, I would say you could use that material as long as it's properly composted.
Okay. Can you add a tarp over the pile to warm up the pile more quicker?
So I'm going to say, remember, it is not the weather that heats up your pile. It's those little microbes getting really busy. So, you know, if you're doing it in the fall or the winter, yeah, it could give them some advantage. But if you put a tarp over it, you're also depriving it of air, and you don't want that. You could devise something where you've got a tarp over the pile, but it's lifted off where there's still airflow. That is certainly a possibility. Although, you know, around here, it just, I don't think it ever gets cold. Well, it depends where you are. It generally doesn't get cold enough, I think, to warrant that. But you can experiment, but just don't deprive your pile of air.
You could maybe put a small tarp over part of it, as long as
Yes.
there's access on the sides,
Yes.
you know, for air.
Yeah. But you're better off just making sure you have enough greens to heat up your pile. And let me add just something here too. If you're using greens and you're having your pile and you're taking temperatures and you really want your pile, you know, hot, all that, and you're willing to put in the time, there are some greens that have I'm going to say a lower C to N ratio. Don't get scared by that. It just means they have more nitrogen in them than others. And those are things like, you know, you can buy alfalfa pellets that people feed their horses or goats or whatever, and you can wet them up so that they're mushy and you spread them around. And because they're a legume, and any kind of legume like your peas, beans, whatever, if you cut them green, they really heat the pile up. Cracked corn does it too. If you know somebody who brews beer, there are spent beer grains. They you want to use them sparingly. So just go slowly if you're going to do this, because it makes that immediate heat in the pile. So if you're going into cold weather, those things you might want to consider adding to your pile just to get more heat. And I would prefer that over covering it with a tarp. I would do a tarp for rain, but not for heat.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to combine these two questions together here. This person has neighbors or people that walk their horses near them. They want to use the horse manure, and they're wondering how to do that. Layers, just one layer, etc. And then part two is this person had recently read that it may be a bad idea to use cow or horse manure, as they may have eaten hay that includes herbicides and pesticides. So what do you both think? And what about antibiotics that are fed to the
Okay, there are several things that are going ping, ping, ping in my mind. So number one, the composting process will take care of a lot of stuff. One thing that I really think people should be aware of if they do horse manure is that the practice of taking care of horses usually involves giving wormers regularly throughout the year. I haven't had horses for a while, but it used to be like 4 times a year. And what I would do is talk to the owners, and if they've just given the wormer to their horse, wait a week, and then after a week take the manure, but don't take the manure within that first week of having the wormer, because the wormers are really there to kill stuff in their gut, and that will potentially have a negative effect on your compost pile. The more persistent herbicides, as well, the last I read about it, they weren't in California yet, but some people are spraying this persistent herbicide on hay, and then horses eat it, and then it really is affecting hay badly. I don't know if that's still the case. I'm hoping California doesn't have it yet. But you could always ask where they get their hay from, and maybe find out, or try a little bit and then test your compost with, is it growing seeds okay or not? That is your test. And then what were your other questions? I can't remember now. It was loaded.
eating hay with herbicides and pesticides.
Okay, so if they ate that, if they do have it with those really bad, I starts with an A, and I'm totally blanking on the name of the pesticide. Oregon State Master Gardeners has they have a great YouTube online about this issue. And I'm just blanking on what it's called. But as I say, I'm hoping it's still not in California, because when I was first brought to my attention, then I looked it up, and at that point, California was not allowing their hay to be sprayed with it. I don't know if that's changed. But all good questions.
Okay. I guess you had mentioned this in your talk. They said this person wants you to kindly repeat. 2 shovels of horse manure is green, but when is it brown? Add layers. How thick? 6 inches. So.
Okay, so first of all, yeah, horse manure is a green. It was listed, somebody wrote in and said their browns included horse bedding, but it included manure. Manure, even though it looks brown, is actually a green material because it's full of nitrogen.
Unless it's fresh.
Yeah, as long as it's fresh. If it's been aged for a year, you could probably call it brown at that point. But assuming that recipe we were looking at, it sounded like it just came right out of the horse stall. So it had bedding, either, I can't remember if it was straw or shavings, it had urine, and it had actual manure. So we're assuming that it was fresh. So that is a green. I personally like to mix my ingredients up, but some people like to layer, and usually, they say 4 inches. I guess you could do 6-inch layers too. I don't, again, we can tell you stuff, you can play with it. But yeah, I mean, I think 4 or 6-inch layer of browns and then greens is just fine. Kelly,
So,
anything to add?
Yeah, and they're just wondering, is it probably best to get the manure early when it's moist rather than later in the day when it's dried out, or does it matter?
I don't think it matters. And what what happens with horse manure after it's been sitting around for a little while, it does get hard. So you just take a shovel and kind of chop it up again, so you have smaller pieces for the microbes. And then when you're going to wet it down when you compost it. So I would say it doesn't. It really doesn't matter as long as it's fresh. If you're getting it as a green, just make sure it's relatively fresh.
Okay, alrighty. I think that's pretty much all the horse manure stuff. So we'll go back to just some other questions here. Is a tumbler composting considered a cold compost?
Kelly, I'll let you take this one.
So a tumbler, you can make hot or cold compost in a tumbler. Generally, though, we find that tumblers are smaller, so it's much harder to do a hot compost in a tumbler if it's kind of the typical tumbler size. You know, not a lot of the tumblers out there are 27 cubic feet or a cubic yard. So it is harder to maintain that heat in there. So I've been playing with this tumbler that we have, and I find it just a little challenging to like wet everything up, make sure everything gets really mixed. So if you are trying to hot compost in a tumbler, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that you can take care of pathogens and weed seeds, because getting all the compost hot enough for long enough and making sure every part of what's in the tumbler actually is hot enough for long enough, I think could be a little bit challenging. So that's one thing that I would say could be really difficult if you want to truly hot compost in a tumbler, aside from the size. So yeah, I think I'm much happier trying a cold kind of compost method where I'm not expecting to, neutralize any pathogens or seeds. And yeah, I'm a little new to tumbling at this point, but that's what I'm finding for now. Yeah. So I hope that's helpful. Nancy, you have anything to add?
No, I think you
there?
said it beautifully.
Okay. Can you put leftover coffee into the compost pile as a way to add more moisture?
I don't see
I
why
don't see
not.
why not.
Yeah. Do you think we do these together much?
I use water that I wash my greens in. Yeah, I try to save any kind of water. I've even tried saving pasta water and using that in the compost pile. It's fine. You get a little bit of added starch. If you salt your water, as long as it's not too much salt and you're adding maybe other water along with it, I think you should be fine.
Yeah, and like anything, just don't overdo it. Like a little coffee, because you're some people are going to go, wait, it's so acidic, and it is. Does it has caffeine? Well, okay, it does. But the pile can handle, as long as you're not like doing half the pile with coffee or half the pile with pasta water. Yeah.
Okay. We're going back to the little insect question. I actually think this is a great question.
Okay.
So this person sees all sorts of insects and worms in their cold compost and in the worm compost bin. How do they know? How can they identify which ones are bad, or are they pretty much all good?
Okay, I'm going to take this first, and then Kelly can follow
for
up.
it.
There are no bad critters out there. They just all have their jobs. So I would say most of the time, whatever you're finding out in the compost as far as critters are, they're probably helping you decompose. If you are finding like an explosion of one kind of critter, that might be something to explore, because it's an indicator of something that's happening in your pile. And I'm more familiar with that personally in a worm bin. For instance, if you find these little teeny tiny white bugs that kind of jump when you put your finger next to them, those are springtails. And if you've overwet your compost, or it's getting a little more on the acidic side, those things are going to be all over everywhere. Do I get worried about it? I don't really, but some people worry. So yeah, I'd say don't get overexcited, but it might be a fun task for you to try to figure out what is there, so you know. I'm trying to think of any insect that would be like bad, and I bad meaning something that you really wouldn't want there, and I can't come up with one right now.
I think the only thing that I could potentially think of is centipedes, just because they predate on other critters in your pile.
But in your cold pile, I wouldn't worry about that so much.
That's
In the
true.
worm bin, I would. In the
That's
cold
true.
pile, it's going to keep populations in balance. So yeah, don't
That's true.
let it bite you. But
Yeah, but I think what Nancy said, where, look for
it's an
in
ecosystem.
imbalance, because an imbalance in a critter would probably indicate an imbalance somewhere, in your compost.
Yeah, and
So,
it could be
maybe
again.
too much water,
That's what I was just going to
maybe not
say.
enough air,
Yeah, and it
something like
might
that.
just mean you need to fluff your pile up a bit. I guess ants are another thing. Like, it's not problematic for the pile itself, but the person managing it may not like to have a pile of ants. And if you do find a lot of ants, well, most likely those little ants don't like disturbance, and you probably, your pile has gotten a little dry. So don't go after the ants. Think about your management of your pile. And then, if you found a bunch of ants trying to do an anthill there, well, turn it and wet it up and see if they dissipate, which I would imagine they would. So I guess that would be one critter where I would, again, they'll be decomposing, they'll be using the food and all that, but yeah, it's not pleasant if you reach in and get ants up your arm. So
Yeah, but a lot of all the critters, they have their place kind of in the process. I mean, so many of them really just help to shred the organic matter into smaller pieces that makes it easier then for bacteria and fungi and to decompose them further.
and they're all eating each other too. So you want a bunch of critters, so you have the predator-prey relationships. That's what's also getting the nutrients into your pile, and that's important as well. So enjoy it. It's a science experiment to see, well, science observation.
And it's usually good news, really.
It is. You might discover, oh my gosh, I didn't know this one was so beneficial. I didn't know that this one ate that one. I didn't. Yeah, there's a lot to learn.
And I would say, I mean, if people are interested, if they can, catch whatever critter it is that they don't recognize, if they can take a look at it under a microscope, Master Gardeners or UCANR has a really good website called UCIPM. So it's just ucipm.com, where you can identify these critters and get a lot more information on them. And you can also take pictures if you can, or at least take descriptions or whatever, and send in questions to the helpline, and we can help identify that also.
Alrighty, I have 3 questions left that are really important, I think. So you could take your time explaining them. First one is, this person likes to hot compost and they have a bin that's 27 cubic feet. I'm guessing probably like a cubic yard bin. So they start a batch and they fill it in, but it tends to shrink. And they're wondering, should they continue to add materials to maintain the volume?
Oh, this is such a good question. And thank you for asking that. It is completely normal for your pile to shrink, because think about it. The material starts out big, and as it gets decomposed, it gets smaller and smaller. It's not unusual for the pile to shrink by a half. And what I would recommend is not adding things, especially if you are doing a hot compost, because one, you want to get it out into the garden faster than cold compost, or number 2, because you want to make sure that the pathogens and weed seeds are basically taken care of. this is why you're doing it. If it's shrinking and you start adding more, you started the process all over again. So now the time is just that much longer for you to get your finished compost. So my recommendation would be finish that pile and just start another one with your new material.
Okay, fantastic. So this is a really great question. This person was told that compost is just a soil amendment. It's not a fertilizer. So do you still have to add fertilizer?
Oh, I love this question. So it really depends who you are. um, it really can be everything a plant needs. So it is an amendment because of the definition of a fertilizer, if I'm saying it correctly, is that it feeds a plant directly, and an amendment feeds it indirectly. It's basically what it's doing is feeding soil microbes, and the soil microbes work to turn the material into a plant available food. So it actually becomes a slow release fertilizer, which is what plants like better. So I would encourage people to try to use just compost or more, I don't like the word organic, but that's the only word I could use, or more organic fertilizers, which feed the soil, which then feeds the plants. It's in the long run, better for your soil, better for the planet, the environment, all of that stuff. Kelly, do you want to add
For your
anything?
plant. I think
One thing I
that
will,
covers
oh,
it.
I'm sorry. Go ahead,
No,
Kelly.
no, no, go ahead, Can.
I was just going to say one thing I will add is even if you don't fertilize, add compost.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, because think about it, like well, especially if you grow food, you're eating the food, and then in the wild, a plant feeds itself. If you think about even just a tree drops its leaves to feed itself. And when we bring these things into our gardens, and especially if we're, if it's a food crop and we're eating the food, then who's feeding the soil so that there's more nutrients? And what we can do is if we're taking, I'm going to use food, eating the food, we could take the rest of the plant, compost it, and put it back into the soil. And that's the way we're trying to help promote the more natural cycling.
All right, so here's the last question, and it's a pretty good one. How should you use the compost? Do you just lay it on top of the soil? Do you add it to potting mix? Do you mix it with your soil? Or all
Should
of
we
the
say all
above?
the above? But
Yes.
Kelly, I'll let you do it. Perfect.
Yes, all of those. So compost is great because, yeah, you can use it in so many different ways. You can just top dress it, so just put it on top of your garden soil, say. You can side dress your plants, which is putting it to, on the soil to the side of the plants. You can add it to potting soil. You can add it to garden soil. You can use it as a seed starting mix. You probably want to sift it so that it's a lot finer if you're going to use it as a seed starting mix. What else? Oh, you can make an extract, which is a really nice way actually to extend the benefits of your compost if you have a little bit of compost and a lot of plants. An extract is when you take compost and basically extract all the goodies from the compost. You can just take a little bit of compost and put it into like a mesh bag. I use a paint strainer bag because they're reusable and strong. But put some compost into like a mesh bag, dunk it into some water, and then massage that bag so that you can extract the nutrients and microbes from the compost into the water, and then you use that water to water your plants. And it's a nice way to use, just a little bit of compost for, potentially like a 5-gallon bucket of compost extract that then you can spread, over a wider area than you would just the solid compost. There's also compost tea, which is a more involved process and a much more difficult process. maybe you can talk about compost tea a little, but that's something that is also, it's actually growing and extracting microbes into um, liquid that then you can water your plants with, or with a compost tea, you can use it as a foliar spray.
And the UC stance on it is
Oh,
so
this is true. Thank you
the,
for adding
that's
this.
okay. From the UC, that's why there's two of us. So from the UC point of view, they have seen a lot of benefit with extracts, and there have been mixed results with foliar sprays up to this point. So it really depends who you ask. Some people say the teas are great. Some people say, well, I don't know. And so UC is kind of, not very definitive about the teas, but they do now support the extracts.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, the biggest difference between compost tea and compost extract is the fact that the extract is done sort of immediately, whereas the tea, you're actively sort of aerating it or letting it sit overnight, and you're kind of breeding that microbes within
And you're feeding them too.
Yes, and you're feeding them. So you're growing that microbe. So it's sort of a more active tea, I guess.
Right.
So,
and really increase population of
right.
microbes
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and go ahead.
so I was just going to say, so you're giving time to the compost to be extracted further, and all while you're feeding the microbes in there. Whereas the extract is just, it's quick, it's immediate, and then the leftovers you could broadcast as well. And extracts, definitely, I don't know about foliar spray with the extract, but a soil drench is highly recommended. So
so the difference there, which is what I was going to say, perfect lead in, Can, was that yes, generally the extract is a soil drench, because what happens with the tea, since you're actively growing the microbes, they have these glues on them because they're active. So when you put it out on leaves, they actually stick. I have, just because I'm lazy sometimes and I only do an extract, sometimes I see a leaf that looks like it's not doing so well, might be getting some fungus or whatever, and I've put some extract on, and I've seen some pretty good results with that. But that's just my own personal story. That's not UC. So anyway, but mainly, yes, you think of extracts in the soil and teas as a spray, but could also be used in the soil.
Oh, and just something that I wanted to add too about using extracts and teas is you want to use them, as quickly as possible after you make them. So, think about it. You've got all these nice aerobic microbes in your compost tea or extract. You don't want them to sit in water and have them go anaerobic. So you want to use them as soon as possible after you make, or obtain an extract or tea.
Yeah, you think about if there's so many of them and they've been growing and growing, and then you take the bubbler away, so you stop putting air out, and all of a sudden there's just all of them, they'll use up that air pretty quickly. So that's why you need to get them out right away.
and plus, they don't belong in water. They need soil, and that's their home. So that you want to put them right in the soil there. So that's a great point. I think that's pretty much all the questions here today. Do you both want to briefly have a closing remark or something that you want to mention for the talk, or promote the next talk that you have coming up?
Well, I was going to say, again, thank you for coming, because I think the more people getting out there composting, the better. It is so much better than just putting it in the green bin or doing nothing. I think we live in an age where it's really, really important that we learn how to take care of our own potential waste product. In this case, none of that's waste, because you get to make garden gold out of it. So thank you for being here. Kelly, I'll let you.
You said it really. I mean, I love being able to turn, something that people might think of as waste into a resource, and a really great resource at that. So, I just encourage everyone, keep composting. If you have, trouble or questions, reach out to the helpline. Or, hopefully you've gotten a lot of little hints here and there today that you can, kind of troubleshoot yourself. Remember the big four: browns, greens, air, water. Keep them in balance. And yes, and good luck. And really everyone can be successful with composting. So
Yes, and if you compost with worms, you have worm bins, come see us in October 12th. We'll be back here talking about worm bins and composting with worms.
yes, it'll be fun.
Well, I just want to say thank you to all the attendees today and all your fabulous questions. And thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Kelly, to you both for answering them all very, very efficiently and effectively. So we will have this recording on our website, and I'll be sure to share the PowerPoint presentation as a PDF with you folks. So you'll have all the resources that both Kelly and Nancy mentioned today. So that's about it. Thank you so much for attending, and be sure to attend next month's class, a follow-up class. And if you have more questions, just send those in and we'll try to address them next class, hopefully.
Great.
Alrighty.
Bye.
So thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
We'll be
everyone.
signing off now. Bye-bye.
Bye.